This is the digital studio session on Cape Town Conversations 2024. And this session will focus on new voices, new structures towards equitable international finance. The Global South's financial future demands urgent attention as nations grapple with high debt, distress, and limited fiscal space for development and climate financing. Beyond ensuring financial stability, the focus must shift to amplifying these economies' voices in shaping global economic policies. And to address these themes, we have a panel that's composed by Chayu Damsinghe. He's head macroeconomic advisory, frontier research of Sri Lanka, and Riato Kibtia, director, Institute for Economic and Social Research, Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia, Indonesia. And so without further ado, my first question to our panelists is how can we better address Global South countries' unique challenges and aspirations by enhancing their representation in multilateral financial institutions? And I'll start with you, Chayu.
Right.
You have the floor.
Yeah, so I think the big question here when you're talking about the Global South's involvement in the multilateral institutions is very much the IMF, right? We had to be open with the question that we are really talking about the IMF and inclusion of Global South voices in the IMF. And that's a very, very fair point because the IMF's voting structure isn't really one that is designed with the concept of the Global South, the concept of developing countries, emerging markets facing debt distress as a primary kind of mechanism for the IMF's existence. It originated rather from the context of the kind of exchange rate mechanisms of the Bretton Woods period. So I think part of the way that I look at this right now is, one, we are now in this post-Bretton Woods kind of environment. We are talking about the global systems themselves changing and the debt distress that countries are facing, the financing questions that they are facing on their fiscal sides. I think all of these are emblematic of the kind of global monetary order right now and the lack of a clear definition of what we are talking about as a global monetary order right now. So I think when you're talking about the requirements of the Global South countries and the involvement in institutions like the IMF, but also in the MDBs as well, in the ADB, in the World Bank, in the AIIB, the African Development Banks, I think there we also need to recognize that a lot of the misrepresentations, a lot of the inability to take factors into consideration do come from that misunderstanding or misplacement of where the global system right now is, how international financial architectures are not really designed for these levels of debt, both in the developing world, but also in the developed world, very high debt burdens there in a non-war kind of context there. So I think overall, one key point is to recognize what those differences have meant for these emerging markets themselves, rather than taking those contexts of the debt distress as unique or isolated problems themselves, but rather as symptoms of a larger global monetary kind of shift that is currently undergoing. And part of that shift will probably mean better representation in these Bretton Woods institutions, in the IMF, in the World Bank, as well as in the development banks across the world. I think without that purely taking it as a question of we need representation alone, I think doesn't necessarily come to the crux of why that representation matters, why that representation doesn't exist. It doesn't come in from the kind of historical narrative of where those institutions came from and why the current representative structure actually ended up coming about.
Thank you for that. So the problem is structural in a way. The lack of voice of developing countries in these multilateral institutions and the inability of these institutions to respond to their needs. But you started by talking about the IMF, which, as you put it, it's a Bretton Woods institution, was created in the post-war period for quite some time now. But the NDBs and several of the development banks are a lot more recent. And so is this a problem that has come up recently, or why aren't the new structures that are being created better adapted for this purpose of addressing the financial and the debt needs of the developing world?
I think one big part of it now, when you talk about the Bretton Woods institution, we can very clearly say these are the Bretton Woods institution, this is the idea of the Bretton Woods. But after the collapse of the Bretton Woods, I don't think we have a very clear idea of what happened afterwards. We don't have a label for it, we don't have a name for it. We are talking about it in a very broad kind of sense. So I think that also ties into the fact that when you have these MDBs coming up, they aren't always coming from the same, I would say, end point. They are also trying to define what this post-Bretton Woods environment has been, and now into, I think, what I would call a post-Bretton Woods kind of environment, trying to define what that period itself is. So I think very much it is about the recognition that these developmental requirements that are there in parts of the world, those themselves are tied to some of those underlying problems as well. So if you look at the successes, for example, poverty alleviation in China and India as to the two big shining examples, where did that come from? There is a lot of credit provision locally. There is a lot of international finance, international aid internationally, and a lot of that is related to the ways that some of these MDBs work. There is a lot of financing support given to the local financial systems, and there is a lot of fiscal support that goes through that kind of mechanism as well. So as the world structurally changes, and we are in this kind of structural shift, how do we recognize and how do we evolve alongside it, I think, is the way that I would frame that kind of situation.
Okay, great. Riato, let me turn to you. What is your take on these issues, and why haven't these multilateral financial institutions been better able to respond to the needs and challenges of the developing world?
I think in the context of the MDBs reform is also is already long addressed. And it is also the commitment under the G20 in the finance track. In terms of the global uncertainty crisis, it's not only like in the COVID-19, it's not only like finance economic crisis and but it links to that like health crisis or in terms of like geopolitics, and that also links to the need of how is actually these MDBs can make or safeguard the need of mitigating the crisis as well. And in terms of the global problem across countries like Global South, it needs a large of pooling fund in terms of the climate finance, for example. And I think the context of developing countries, the economic size of developing countries, even under the G20, improve, and the developed countries is now maybe less than the developing countries as a group, but in terms of the governance and representations, or how is actually they might add on the pooling fund, is quite limited, I think. In the context of quota and the voting rights is not quite changed to address the different context right now. So in that case, how is actually that might function better address the common problems under the Global South? It is also maybe an issue in terms of the effectiveness, but we have here like bilateral cooperations and also other financing institutions that are also evolve in the current year. And I think even in the private sectors as well. So I think that's also complement or competing in itself to the MDBs to perform better. But in terms of development, they still quite, not dominant, but usually initiating or piloting, at least in Asia and in the context of Africa, I think is also big. Well.
Thanks for that. So we live in a period of multi-crisis. And from what you just said, the reforms of these financial institutions haven't gone far enough, or they haven't been satisfactory to respond to these multi-crises. But new structures are coming up, and you also mentioned private finance, which seems to be something that's very much on the table. So the second question has to do with sovereign debt frameworks. How can they be reformed, as they are essential to alleviate the debt distress and unlock financial resources for climate action and sustainable development? Chayu, the floor is yours.
I mean, this is a topic where I am very biased. I come from a country that 2 years ago went through sovereign default itself. My chief gripe, actually, and very much emblematic of this kind of multi-crisis environment that we are in, is the fact that a lot of sovereign debt resolution frameworks, in my view, tend to be quite quantitative in an environment of high uncertainty, ambiguity about the future. And for me, that creates a context where you're talking about extremely precise, extremely specific, extremely narrow policy pathways that end up being part of how the global sovereign debt architecture works in terms of reform, in terms of moving out of that, in terms of debt targets that you have to meet. And those targets, those futures, those policies are defined through extremely quantitative, extremely specific things in this context of uncertainty. So I feel there is a mismatch there. When you're talking about 5 years down the line, you need this monthly target to become, within a 0.1% space. That feels like a completely impractical target to set up. And the target itself is, for me, that means the target hasn't recognized the actual reality of the problems that are being faced, right? It is a question of volatility. We are in a period of uncertainty. So for me, that is a big problem with the global sovereign debt architecture and the financial architecture, because ultimately, whatever those targets that are set, whatever the outcomes that are expected, that is then how, even if you take the question of private finance, that is what private financing itself is based out of. We're talking about financial flows, capital flows that based on. It still looks at the sovereign debt framework, the architecture that is currently existing, and is based upon that the future kind of trajectories that they themselves would engage with is based off. So for me, that is a fundamental mismatch of understanding the kind of world where we live in. So it ties back to the previous point that I made about the involvement of the Global South in the MDBs, involvement of the Global South in the financial institutions, where I feel, and even the role of the MDBs right now and overall, I think it is one where we are looking at solutions that are geared for a world of yesterday, without recognizing that we are not in a world of today, we are in a world of tomorrow already. And I think that mismatch to me is the fundamental kind of problem in the international financial architecture. The problem, of course, is one that I think it is in the process of being resolving, in the kind of massive shifts that we're talking about, even these conversations about de-dollarization, the conversations about how the dollar is strengthening faster and faster when you're talking about de-dollarization, which, on an intuitive sense doesn't make sense. But that is, of course, how the financial and trade flows in the current world end up creating that kind of environment. So I think because of that uncertainty, right? So I do think that we are in the middle of that shift, and some parts of the global world, the financial world, are on one side of that shift, some of them are in the middle of it, and some of them are on the other side. And I do feel that intergovernmental organizations, any organization that has a strong bureaucratic front, just generally would tend to be a bit slower on the uptake of any large shift that's happening. And I think that bureaucratic resistance, friction is something that we are kind of seeing ourselves as well.
I see. So we live in a rapidly changing world. Uncertainty is very high, and the institutions and the frameworks just can't keep up to a certain extent, and that is a problem. Riyatu, what is your take on the issue of sovereign debt framework reform?
I think in that context, I think Chayu has also mentioned about it, and in terms of I'm not much familiar on the IMF, but in the World Bank, there is independent evaluation group. I think in the context of IMF, it is more of a top-down. So that kind of evaluations, or how is actually managing, even in the context of private, there is restructuring, sitting together, creditor and debitor. So that's the flexibility and the way of that models might be needs to also learn from others institution as well, given that rigid conditionality. But I think they are also under now critical supervision, I think, from other members as well. So it needs to change in terms of MDBs. But I'm not sure whether there are for example, in the case of after the financial crisis in Indonesia's in Asia, as Asia 97, so we don't establishing. We try to establish Chiang Mai initiative and all. It needs to as more of complementary. It needs to, if one institution is not quite speed up in terms of the response, we have that alternatives. It's not about replacing, but more of the choice, I think, or options on that. Yeah.
I see. So we need more flexibility in many ways, and
Alternative or options.
yeah, and unfortunately, we do have models to
Yeah,
look up
yeah,
to achieve that greater flexibility. Excuse me. And with this, let me move to our final question, because our time is running up, which has to do particularly with Africa. So the question is, what role should multilateral organizations and domestic governments play in bolstering development financing in the region, in the continent? Chayu, I'll start with you.
So I'll use a very particular example from Sri Lanka to kind of illustrate something happened here, because we are talking about a context where there isn't a lot of financing coming into lots of the developing world right now, and I think that's part of the problem. We're talking about infrastructure development not really coming through in the same lens that we want. The kind of surpluses that are built up by the countries like Germany, like China, like Japan, doesn't really get recycled into the into South America, into Africa, into Asia in the same ways that, let's say, money might have gotten cycled 40, 50 years ago, because the requirements are also very different, right? So I think one particular example that I would like to give is, it's a counterintuitive one here, is that there have been points in Sri Lanka where, rather than points, it's a constant story where our health and education systems have generally ranked quite well in terms of performance, but investment into them, particularly government investment, has been ridiculously low. And it's not just a Sri Lankan problem, it's a South Asian question. But why does that happen? How do you both have very low investment, but also really good standards that come through? That didn't really make a lot of sense. So one part of that we've seen is that there's a lot of financing that goes into purely just the consumption side of the economy, right? You're not looking at it as investment, you're not looking at it as education, healthcare, development initiative. It's regular consumption. But what that does mean is that the private sector has developed to such an extent that it has ended up playing the role of development itself. So it's not just financing explicitly aimed at development, it's financing, general finance for consumption that has improved quality of life, that has improved consumption and improved GDP growth, to be very straightforward. And that has meant that the private sector has been able to play that role, even at, let's say, the lower rungs of society, of course, at the higher rungs of society as well. So I think when we are looking at the multilateral organization and domestic governments in terms of how that financing role comes in, I think that's one aspect to also consider, because when you are talking about points where coordinating large measures, coordinating these bigger projects becomes hard, can you focus on a few of those and then see whether you can develop local financial conditions, local markets, local bond markets, for example, things like that, that perhaps might not be directly aimed at development, but they do end up playing that role indirectly, and we do have evidence of that working as well. So it's not just the markets better equals country better, not saying that's straightforward, of course, but where the involvement, particularly improvement of growth conditions at the lower levels, has helped the private sector step into very specific places. So how can you kind of allow for that and encourage that, and of course avoid all the pits and falls that go alongside that as well?
Great. So resorting to the private sector and maybe localizing of some sort.
Localized private sector is, I think, a great way.
Might be a way to move forward when we can't move forward in a more general approach. Riyatu.
Yeah, I think the context of these MDBs is still the major counterpart is with the government. So the government needs to function, and I think in terms of that sustainability resource again, that it will aiming also how is like economic growth translated to domestic resource mobilizations. And in the case of Africa, this is the resource-based countries like Indonesia. And some countries as well, it needs to also carefully needs to manage this natural resource and how is actually maybe nature-based solutions and how to mitigate at the same time managing this natural resource quite for the endowment that be for the long term as well as improving other economic activities. So I think in that context, like natural resource tax can be an option that needs also to be related also that it might also drives to climate or green growth possibly in that area. I think that needs to be improved. actually, like in the case of Indonesia, in terms of public financial management, we also learn from South Africa. So in terms of the transparency and accountability, it's quite good, and it is also when we start decentralizations, one of the benchmark like learning together other than among ASEAN countries is also from here.
A lot of proposals and diagnostics of the problem of global finance for the developing world have been put forth here. We have a mismatch between the existing institutions and the needs and challenges of the developing world because we live in a world that's changing very fast and that uncertainty is very high. We have some models to follow. We need greater flexibility. We should resort to the private sector, to localization, to better resource management. And with that, I'll close the section and I'll thank our speakers.